Even before the Soviet army entered Afghanistan, Afghans had already lost trust in their own government. The king, soldiers, communists, Islamists, and various political groups were already fighting over power. And on April 27, 1978, soldiers and military officers allied with the communist PDPA took action. They brought tanks into Kabul and surrounded the presidential palace. At the same time, Afghan Air Force fighter jets attacked. President Mohammed Daoud Khan refused to surrender, so there was intense gunfire. Before the day ended, Daoud was killed and his government fell. But in reality, this chaos did not start suddenly. In fact, it took many years to build up. And in this video, we will find out how the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979. So let's get started. In 1967, Afghanistan was a poor but relatively peaceful country under King Zahir Shah. Afghanistan has long been surrounded by stronger countries. It is located between South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East. Because of this, its location is important for trade, military movement, and the security of the entire region. But the country is also difficult to control. There are many mountains, and the villages are far apart. The tribes, ethnic groups, languages, and local leaders are all different. Religion and tradition are also strong, especially in the countryside. In Kabul and other cities, schools, government offices, hospitals, and modern buildings are gradually increasing. But in the provinces and remote villages, people still live traditionally. So while the cities are becoming modern, almost nothing changes in the countryside. In the cities, there are young people who want faster modernization, more jobs, broader education, and greater rights for women. In the countryside, many families worry that rapid change might destroy their religion, culture, and traditional way of life. That's why King Zahir gradually implemented reforms. In 1964, he implemented a new constitution that gave greater freedom to the media, students, and political groups. But this new system was weak, and it did not immediately solve the country's problems. In truth, their government was often weak, lawmaking was slow, and ordinary citizens did not immediately feel the changes. As time went on, the universities in Kabul became centers of intense debate. Some supported the monarchy. Some wanted to make the country more democratic. There were Islamists who believed that religion should be at the center of government. And there were also communists who admired the Soviet Union. This is where the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan became stronger. The PDPA was a small communist party formed in 1965. Among its main leaders were Nur Muhammad Taraki, Babrak Karmal, and Hafizullah Amin. They believed that Afghanistan needed to change quickly. They wanted to reduce the power of wealthy landowners, expand education, change the old system in the countryside, and build a government similar to socialist states. But they had little support among ordinary Afghans. They were stronger among some students, teachers, government employees, and soldiers who had studied or trained in the Soviet Union. Despite this, conflict quickly arose within the PDPA. It split into two main groups. The Khalq, led by Nur Taraki and Amin, was more aggressive and wanted to seize power quickly. The Parcham, on the other hand, led by Karmal, was more cautious and more willing to work first with other political groups. Both were communist, but their approaches were different, and this conflict would become important in the years to come. Along with the rise of the communists, the Islamists, who wanted to make Islam the center of government, were also gaining strength. This was not yet the Taliban. These were other Islamist groups that were active during that time. Many of the early Islamists were educated students and teachers who debated how to combine modern education, science, government, and Islamic values. One of the most important groups was the Jamiat-e-Islami. For them, communism was dangerous because it didn't just want to change the economy. They also saw it as a threat to the religion and traditions of Afghanistan. So as the 1970s approached, the educated part of society became even more divided. One side looked towards Soviet-style socialism. The other side wanted to form a government that was more centered on Islam. Meanwhile, The royal government tried not to fully side with either the United States or the Soviet Union. This was important because it was the height of the Cold War. At that time, the United States and the Soviet Union were rivals. Both of them were looking for countries they could help and influence. Afghanistan did not officially side with either of the two. It received projects and aid from the United States and other Western countries, but the Soviet Union played a bigger role in military equipment, training, roads, airports, and other infrastructure. Afghanistan is close to the southern border of the Soviet Union. So for Moscow, this was not just an ordinary poor country. It was part of their security. The Soviet leaders did not want a government there that would be allied with the United States or become a base for Western intelligence. For Washington, Afghanistan was important, but it was not as important as Iran, Pakistan, or other major American allies in the region. Because of this, the connection between the Afghan military and the Soviet Union deepened, with many Afghan officers using Soviet weapons and receiving Soviet training. Eventually, some of these officers would become an important force in seizing power. But before that, the monarchy fell first. In July 1973, King Zahir Shah was out of the country. His cousin and former prime minister, Mohammed Daoud Khan, took advantage of this. With the help of some military officers, he carried out a coup with almost no major fighting. He ended the monarchy and declared Afghanistan a republic. Daoud became the first president of Afghanistan. At first, he was supported by some leftists and members of Parcham. They thought he would push for rapid change in the country. They thought he would bring faster modernization and greater political change. But once he gained control of the government, he gradually removed his former allies. Daoud didn't want any other political group that could become strong enough to challenge him. He limited the opposition. He weakened the communist influence in the government. He dismissed or transferred some officials he didn't trust. And instead of forming a true democratic republic, his leadership became more personal. Daoud was the center of power. Daoud also had his own problems with Pakistan. The two countries had long disputed the border and the future of the Pashtuns living on both sides of it. There was an idea back then that there should be a larger territory for the Pashtuns. Pakistan opposed this because it could weaken or divide their own country. Because of this, Pakistan started supporting some Afghan Islamists who were opponents of Daoud. In 1975, the Islamists attempted to start an uprising against his government. It failed. Many were killed, arrested, or fled to Pakistan. Among those who escaped were some men who would become well-known commanders in the coming wars. In Pakistan, those who escaped found a safe place, training, and support that they could use against Kabul. It was here that the armed Islamist opposition began to organize, which would later become part of the larger Mujahideen resistance. Despite this, Daoud gradually distanced himself from the Soviet Union. He did not want Afghanistan to rely solely on Moscow's aid, weapons, and influence. So he reached out to the United States, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and India, and he also tried to fix relations with Pakistan. Daoud wanted Afghanistan to freely engage with different countries without the Soviet Union dictating to it. When he visited the Soviet Union in 1977, he had tensions with Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. Moscow was worried about Daoud's growing connections with other countries. But Daoud's answer was clear. Afghanistan is a free and independent country and should not be dictated by any other government, who it can talk to or allow into the country. From then on, he became even more suspicious in the eyes of the Soviet leadership. But this doesn't mean that Moscow directly planned everything that would happen next. Until now, historians still debate how big a role the Soviet Union played in the events of 1978. What is clear is that the PDPA was close to Moscow and had strong connections with officers who used the Soviet military system. In April 1978, Mir Akbar Khyber, a well-known member of the PDPA, was killed. It is not clear who killed him. At his funeral, thousands of communist supporters marched in Kabul. Because of this, the government became afraid that the PDPA might revolt and seize power. Daoud saw the protest as a major threat, So he ordered the arrest of the main leaders of the PDPA. But he made one crucial mistake. Hafizullah Amin, one of the main leaders of the PDPA, was not arrested immediately. So before he was finally captured, he was still able to send orders to the military officers who were allies of the party. He told them to start the takeover of the government, and then it happened. On April 27, 1978, tanks began rolling out of the military bases. They went to Kabul. They were supported by planes from the Afghan Air Force. The presidential palace, government offices, and important communication centers were attacked. It turned out that the PDPA had infiltrated more people into the military than Daoud had thought. Daoud and his guards fought inside the palace. He refused to surrender. In the end, he was killed along with some members of his family and staff. In just one day, the republic that he himself had established 5 years earlier collapsed. The communists called the event the Saur Revolution. But for many historians, it was a violent military coup. A small communist party suddenly seized power even though it was not supported by the majority of Afghans. Because of this, Nur Muhammad Taraki became the new leader of Afghanistan. Hafizullah Amin, on the other hand, became one of the most powerful officials in the new government. Babrak Karmal was also given a high position. At first glance, it seemed that the communists had completely won. They controlled Kabul, the government, and a large part of the military. But they were not supported by most Afghans. The new communist government implemented rapid and forced changes. If anyone resisted, the government used arrests, torture, and killings. Because of this, instead of stabilizing the country, the rebellion against them grew. Eventually, the Soviet Union would fear that the communist government in Kabul would completely collapse. After the PDPA seized power, they announced on the radio that what they called the Saur Revolution had succeeded. But for many Afghans, this was not the beginning of positive change. It was a warning that greater chaos was coming. Nur Muhammad Taraki became the leader of the new government. Hafizullah Amin quickly became his most powerful associate. They immediately implemented major changes. They distributed some of the land owned by wealthy landowners. They canceled many debts of poor farmers. They expanded education. They banned forced marriages and tried to strengthen women's rights. Some of these goals were good. The problem was the way they implemented these changes was sudden and forced. The changes were not properly explained to people in the villages first. They also didn't include the tribal leaders, elders, and religious leaders whom the people trusted in the discussions. If anyone objected, they were often considered enemies of the revolution. Thousands suspected of being enemies of the government were arrested. Many were imprisoned, tortured, or killed without proper trial. Among those targeted were former officials, landowners, teachers, tribal leaders, and mullahs. Because of this, the reforms that were supposed to help the people were seen as attacks on their religion and traditions. The uprising spread to different provinces. The armed groups fighting against the communist government became known as the Mujahideen. They were not yet a single organized army. They were made up of different groups, local commanders, tribes, and Islamist movements. Each had their own leaders and beliefs. Meanwhile, the communists also fought among themselves within their own party. Taraki and Amin removed the Parcham leaders from the government who could potentially become their rivals. This included Babrak Karmal, Anahita Ratebzad, and Muhammad Najibullah. Some were sent as ambassadors to other countries to keep them away from Kabul, while others were arrested and imprisoned. As the resistance grew, the government resorted to even more violence. Instead of weakening the uprising, it only grew stronger. In February 1979, Adolf Dubs, the ambassador of the United States, was kidnapped in Kabul. The Afghan security forces tried to rescue him, but it ended in a shootout, and Dubs was killed. Because of this, the United States distanced itself even more from the communist government and reduced its aid to Afghanistan. A bigger problem followed in March. The people in Herat, one of the largest cities in the country, revolted. Some soldiers from the Afghan army joined the rebellion. Several Soviet advisors and their families were also killed. The government used military aircraft and heavy weapons to retake the city. Many people died. but the exact number is uncertain. There is a large gap in the estimates because the reports about what happened are different. The Herat uprising is important because it showed that it was no longer just small groups in the mountains who were fighting. Even city residents and government soldiers could now rebel. Taraki and Amin are now afraid that their government might completely collapse. They repeatedly asked the Soviet Union for soldiers, but at first Moscow refused. The Soviet leaders knew that it was easy to enter Afghanistan but difficult to control the entire country. There are many mountains, the villages are far apart, and it's not easy to tell who is an ordinary citizen and who is a rebel. KGB chief Yuri Andropov also warned that a foreign army could not solve Afghanistan's political problems. Instead of immediately sending a large army, the Soviet Union first provided more weapons, tanks, helicopters, military advisors, and training. But the Afghan army continued to weaken. Many soldiers deserted, refused to fight, or joined the Mujahideen. As the war worsened, the conflict between Taraki and Amin also deepened. They were both communists, both wanted to stay in power, and both blamed each other for the collapse of the government. In September 1979, Taraki's camp tried to remove Amin. Amin escaped, and he was the first to take action. Taraki was arrested and later killed. According to historical accounts, he was strangled with a pillow. After this, Amin became the leader of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union did not like this. For Moscow, Amin became too violent and untrustworthy. They also believed that he further weakened the government and increased the people's anger. The KGB also became suspicious because Amin once studied in the United States and later tried to establish contact with Washington. There was no solid evidence that he was a CIA agent, but in the middle of the Cold War, suspicion alone was enough to make Soviet leaders fear that he might break away from Moscow and move closer to America. Meanwhile, some rebels were receiving increasing support from outside Afghanistan. Pakistan allowed various Afghan opposition groups to set up bases in their country. There was also support from other countries that feared the spread of Soviet influence. For Moscow, this was no longer just a problem for their allied government. It was also a threat to their southern border. If the communist government fell, the Soviet Union could end up with a hostile or pro-Western Afghanistan right next to Soviet Central Asia. Moscow's position gradually changed. The leaders who were once again sending troops began to believe that Amin needed to be removed and the communist government saved. On December 12, 1979, the Soviet leadership secretly approved the military intervention. The plan was not just to help Amin. The real plan was to kill him and replace him with Babrak Karmal, the communist leader he had previously exiled. The Soviet leaders thought the operation would be quick. Their army would enter, take control of key cities and bases, and replace the leader. After that, the new Afghan government would face the rebellion. On December 25, thousands of Soviet soldiers began crossing the border along with tanks, armored vehicles, helicopters, and military aircraft. One group passed from the north towards Kabul. The other moved in the direction of Herat. And in Kandahar, airborne troops also seized important airports and government facilities. But Amin didn't know that the very soldiers he was waiting for to help him were the same ones sent to kill him. He was then living in the Tajbeg Palace, located on a high part of Kabul. Its defenses were strong. There were guards and tanks, military barracks, and landmines planted around the area. But the Soviet forces were very familiar with the place because they themselves were helping with Amin's security. They also had a special unit composed of soldiers from Soviet Central Asia. They wore Afghan uniforms, so they wouldn't be easily recognized. On December 27, they were ready to attack. While the Soviet army was spreading throughout Kabul, the special forces quickly moved toward the palace. Within just a few hours, Amin would realize that the Soviets' arrival was not a rescue operation. It was a secret government takeover, and he was the main target. On the night of December 27, 1979, Hafizullah Amin still believed that the Soviet army had arrived to save his government. He didn't know that the operation to kill him had already begun. As the Soviet special forces approached the Taj Beg Palace, other Soviet agents were secretly weakening the defenses of Kabul. Some communication lines were destroyed, and some Afghan military vehicles were disabled. At the same time, Soviet troops quickly took over the radio and television stations. Military headquarters, ministries, prisons, and other important government buildings. Their goal was to cut off communications and prevent the Afghan army from providing assistance to Amin. By nightfall, Operation Storm 333 had begun. The Soviet forces bombarded and fired at the guard posts and tanks surrounding the palace. Several Soviet armored vehicles were destroyed while climbing the steep road. As a result, the soldiers were forced to dismount and continue the attack on foot. The Afghan guards put up a strong defense. There was intense fighting inside the palace. The Soviet troops entered the rooms one by one until they reached the upper part of the building. There, they found and killed Amin. His 2 children were also killed, along with many of his bodyguards. The main attack was over in less than an hour. The operation was swift. But many soldiers and Afghan defenders were killed or wounded. Historical reports differ regarding the exact number of casualties. In just one night, the leader, who just days earlier had been asking Moscow for help, was gone. The next day, the Soviet Union installed Babrak Karmal as the new leader of Afghanistan. Karmal promised that torture, killings, and excessive use of force would stop. But for many Afghans, he was not truly an independent leader. They saw him as a leader brought to Kabul by a foreign army. In just a few days, the Soviet Union replaced the government and took control of key parts of the country. But it did not gain the trust of the people. Instead, more Afghans joined the resistance or fled to Pakistan. Why did the Soviet leaders proceed with the invasion, even though they knew it was dangerous? There wasn't just one reason that pushed them. They first feared the communist government might collapse entirely. Second, they no longer trusted Amin and suspected that he might move closer to the United States. Third, they didn't want to lose control over a country next to their southern border. And finally, they believed they could repeat what they did in other countries. Quickly send troops, install a new leader, and restore order. On December 12, the Soviet Politburo secretly approved the deployment of what they called a limited military contingent. This was not part of a long and clear plan to occupy Afghanistan. It was a quick decision made out of fear of losing an ally in the middle of the Cold War. But their main assumption was wrong. They thought their troops would only stay for a few months. They thought they would just guard the major cities, while the Afghan government would fight the rebels. They underestimated the people's anger and the challenge of fighting small groups in the mountains and villages. Other countries responded quickly. The United States condemned the invasion as a regional threat, and President Jimmy Carter's administration imposed sanctions. It was only then that the Soviets understood how much support and strengthening the rebels had received, and how difficult it was to fight them. The battle also became more important in the United States strategy. On December 27, they were ready to launch their attack. Saudi Arabia and various groups provided funding, while China and other countries that wanted to weaken the Soviet Union quickly offered their help. Because of this, the former civil war in Afghanistan became one of the biggest battles of the Cold War. It was no longer just the Afghan government against the Afghan rebels. Behind them were powerful countries providing money, weapons, intelligence, and training. The United Nations General Assembly also condemned the foreign military intervention and called for the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. But Moscow did not back down. The number of Soviet troops continued to increase. The Mujahideen also kept getting stronger. What was supposed to be a quick change of government turned into almost 10 years of war. With every new soldier sent by Moscow, more Afghans believed that they were no longer just fighting the communist government. They were now fighting a foreign occupation. The Soviet Union took control of Kabul, airports, main roads, and major cities. But they never fully controlled the mountains, villages, and countryside. That's where the problems began. Problems that tanks and helicopters couldn't solve. It's easy to replace a leader. It's much harder to force an entire country to accept a government it doesn't want. The operation at Taj Beg Palace was over in just a few minutes, but the war it started would last until February 1989, and its effects on Afghanistan would continue for many decades.